In opening government, IBADUA. In opening opposition, White House B. In closing government, Tel Aviv A. And in closing opposition, Yale A. Okay, before we begin, I'd like to remind audience members to please turn your phones off or to silent, and to please refrain from talking loudly or cheering unnecessarily. If you would really like your speaker to win, what is going to be most persuasive is us hearing them speak, not hearing you tap the tables. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to speak to the motion.
In a vast majority of developing countries around the world, individuals are systematically being harmed by the overusage of things like antibiotics. Individuals have been oversubscribed things like antibiotics for even things such as common cold, which makes them systematically immune, vulnerable to the worst and pernicious diseases at a later point in time. Even if they're not used medically, they're used in things like fertilizers, which ruin arable land, or ruin the fruits that grow in them with things and drugs like formalin in fruits all across India and Bangladesh that systematically create the worst and most pernicious diseases and harm human health. The aim of our debate is not to make humans suffer more, but to change this culture and attitude, and we'll prove that we successfully change this culture with our model. Why does this happen though in the status quo? There are a couple of incentives that make this happen. First, doctors oversubscribe because they're always looking for quick and fast solutions to the most basic diseases, because it's often a race to build reputation within these countries that get you the most customers or the most people that come to you. So they're looking for very quick solutions that appeal to a largely uneducated group of people who are not aware of the discourse around drugs. Secondly, there's a huge incentive by pharmaceutical companies that operate there to push these drugs within these doctors and make sure they subscribe it. But thirdly, the state has no incentive to counterbalance this, because one, there's no democratic pressure on this. They care about more things like economic policies and foreign policies. There's very little awareness of the discourse related to drugs. Secondly, there's a large degree of doctors' hegemony within these countries that is not counterbalanced. The doctor ratio within these countries is very low. There are few doctors for largely overpopulated countries. We need to change that. How is the model that we're going to operate under? About 4 to 5 things that we're going to do. Firstly, this probably only applies to countries that largely can't manufacture these drugs themselves. Otherwise, this model is like a wash on either case. Even if there are productions within countries by pharmaceutical companies, we think they largely need ingredients that the World Health Organization and foreign donors supply them with. And this is unlikely to exist in the status quo in a vast majority of countries because of strong IP laws that are governing the pharmaceutical industry. So I do think this applies to a vast majority of countries who cannot make this themselves. Secondly, this obviously intuitively means it's not just the drugs we'll stop selling, we'll also stop selling the ingredients that make these drugs. Thirdly, we won't do this instantaneously. There'll be a grace period of 6 months to a year or whatever arbitrary amount of time for them to fix their culture. Fourthly, it will obviously not be permanent. The moment the culture is fixed, we'll reverse the ban. Fifthly, this also applies to multinationals operating within that country itself, so they cannot randomly create a subsidiary and claim this does not fall under WHO regulations. The broader aspect of this debate, the World Health Organization, how they are able to change this culture, and why that is the most likely scenario within our world. Before that, sure.
Does compliance look like just the existence of regulation or actual compliance on the ground?
Compliance probably means the change of culture, which we can monitor through things that WHO obviously does. We don't expect 100% regulation because that's impossible, but large state movements to do this is good enough incentive within our world. I don't think you can ensure 100% on either world for any regulation whatsoever. That's implausible. Okay, why does the WHO operate, and how do they create a culture change? Firstly, the WHO often has huge amounts of political capital within the most vulnerable zones of the most vulnerable countries, because they're often the only sole provider of drugs to places the state can't reach through their NGOs or the NGOs they empower. Or secondly, they systematically assist medical professionals with the research and capacity necessary to provide certain aid within those countries or reach that aid. We think this WHO has been one of the biggest tools by which developing countries have improved their health sanitation and standards, whether it's all across Africa in the recent past or the large improvement in medical standards across subcontinental Asia and Southeast Asia in the past. Why do we think the WHO can thus change cultures? 3 reasons under this. First, they can provide the state the necessary incentive to start acting and change this culture, which currently doesn't exist. Why is this the case? Because even if the state is dubiously democratic, which exists in vast majority of these countries, the dubiously democratic states across the world depend on satisfaction based on economy and based on the health standards of people. Because if that doesn't exist, there's likely to be a huge amount of state like opposition to the state in terms of revolution, because the health and well-being through foods and fruits are the most important forms of satisfaction for people. Why do we think this thus changes? The lack of antibiotics or the lack of the ability to have a proper culture or access to these means the state no longer has the ability to use its current incentives by pushing and keeping people quickly happy by giving them quick solutions to diseases or fruits that stay pure for 6 to 7 months even though they're filled with chemicals. This means they often have no alternatives to the kinds of economic structures that empower these things right now. The ways in which the health system of the country runs is likely to cripple, and if the state doesn't protect this, they're likely to face the biggest amount of opposition they've faced in the recent past to any kind of control they've had. This is a huge problem that the state has an incentive to fix. Secondly, why do pharmaceutical companies have an incentive to fix this? First, assuming this is being sold at such a high degree to such a vast number of people, this is one of the biggest sources of revenue that currently exists. The lack of ingredients to make these products means it systematically cripples the largest shares that they have or the ability to satisfy the largest shareholders they have. They're likely to change their incentives. Secondly, the alternative sources they're likely to tap into are unlikely to not give them the same results. So even if they access some weird mythical black market the opposition can argue with, it is unlikely to yield the same results that the status quo does. But secondly, it's unlikely to be as stable or as readily accessible as the status quo does. So the pharmaceutical companies are likely to start these campaigns that we've seen happen across the developing country that they currently have no incentive to do. They're likely to inform people about the uses. They're likely to pressurize doctors in different ways to change the ways that they prescribe these medicines, and they have the biggest political capital to do this. Thirdly, the vast majority of people are likely to trigger the right kind of discourse. Why is this the case? Because recognize these drugs are an everyday staple now. They go into a pharmaceutical, like a pharmacy, they don't need prescriptions at times and just get these, or they get really easy prescriptions. The moment they walk into those pharmacies and no longer see these drugs, that's the first time they question, wait, that was an everyday part of my life that no longer exists. In the status quo, they have no incentive to do this now because it's just readily available and they have other things to worry about. Everyday human beings are likely to be aware of the fact that there's a change to their circumstances in life. Discourse is likely to be generated on the ground level, which is what they're likely to propose, which means people start asking questions, triggering the necessary conversations, or approaching the right kind of people. This is a very likely world which is likely to be reached, and the only one that can pressurize this from happening is the WHO, who has the ability to reach this world. Very glad to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. Welcome the opposition leaders to begin the case for opposition. Hear, hear.
Just something that would be convenient to point out at the top half of this debate, people still need antibiotics. People still need to have their livelihood. People still need to stop getting sick and to stop dying, right? The fact of the matter is that opening government's case puts real people on the ground at risk. It hurts people and it destroys their lives. It can kill them, right? This is the justification of weighing that we needed out of opening government that has been absent so far. 3 constructive arguments in this speech. Firstly, on the principle. Secondly, on culpability. And thirdly, on outcomes. Reputation is going to be entirely integrated. I want to start with the principle. We would posit to you an opening opposition that if there was somebody who needed to save their life at a huge environmental cost in order to make sure that at that moment they literally didn't die, we would say that that is something that we say is principally justified, right? Because it's the principle of self-defense. It's the idea that when you're doing to save your life, the way that it affects other people is not something that you ought to consider. The thing you should prioritize in self-defense is your right to life. We say that the exact same situation applies when it comes to antibiotics, right? Because even if it's true on opening government that we are increasing resistance to these antibiotics, and it's the case that this might have impacts on people's health in the future, I think in the immediate term, people who are actually sick and need this have the right to make sure that they access that. That's the principle that we stand on opening opposition, is the idea that people can access this as a form of exercising their self-defense. But moreover, it also connects to a larger sense about your right to life, right? I think individual medical care is a right that everybody has as a natural extension of your right to life. That is to say, somebody who needs access to care deserves that care because that is the way that we maximize their livelihood against something that is preventable, right? At the point at which things are preventable, we ought to maximize those, right? Those are the things that we ought prioritize in this debate, because even if opening government is correct that there's an impending doom coming from the overprescription of antibiotics, it does not justify the sacrificing the right to life and the right to self-defense that naturally exists in all people in these countries already. Let's talk about culpability. I think the first thing to note here is that the people are absolutely not culpable for the government's lack of regulation. That is to say, an action which punishes these people on account of what the government does is fundamentally unjustified. We would draw a parallel to the way that we currently employ sanctions. That is to say, we think that sanctions must be targeted specifically to target those that are culpable. That's why we sanction things like in Russia, we sanction like key members of the Kremlin being able to access Western universities and stuff like that, rather than broad sweeping sanctions that hurt the entire country, right? It's the exact same principle here. It's recognizing that the people are not culpable for the actions of their state, be it lack of regulation or otherwise, and these are things that we absolutely cannot tolerate as a form of punishment. But beyond that, I want you to note here that these people might not be able to enforce it to success. Look, our standard is not 100% regulation, right? That's not what the burden we're trying to push on an opening government, right? But I think it's important to note here that these countries might not be able to enforce even to the extent that these countries want, right? So I think, first of all, the incentive structure that opening government says they're going to get might not apply because there might be a systemic inability to regulate. What does this look like? I think the first thing it looks like is recognizing that they literally might not have the medical infrastructure to successfully regulate. They might not have a successful auditing system for doctors and the prescriptions, right? They might not have the ability to spend as much time in the emergency room successfully diagnosing people on account of the fact that there is overcrowded as opening government says, right? These are the reasons why it might be hard to regulate successfully, and no amount of incentive that opening government describes is going to successfully change that, right? But I want to also note something here, is that the main reason often that these places have low levels of regulation, where this regulation doesn't exist at all, right? That's government's best case scenario, is a world in which US pharmaceutical companies are lobbying for said low regulation, right? These companies are lobbying so that they can prescribe as many of their antibiotics as possible in the short term. I want you to note here that the way that this actually pans out under opening government's world is that this profit incentive still exists, right? On opening government, they tell you that what's going to happen is that they're going to lobby for regulation so they can spend some pharmaceuticals. But we would say that probably something that's a lot more likely is that these countries withdraw from the WHO period under intense lobbying pressure from the pharmaceuticals so that they're no longer bounded under the jurisdiction, right? And I want you to note here something, right? This nebulous black market that opening government talks about is not really that nebulous, right? At the point at which you leave the WHO, US pharmaceuticals, the way that they try to model out, are allowed legally under the WHO to sell pharmaceuticals to these countries nonetheless, as long as they're not under the jurisdiction and therefore not under the ban, right? These are the real policies that US pharmaceutical companies lobby for. And I want you to note, I think it's reasonable to say that they'll be successful at lobbying for this practice because they were already so successful at lobbying for incredibly low regulation of things like antibiotics, right? It's the exact same power they had in the first place that allows them to have that power in the future. Closing.
Yeah, let's say I have Ebola and somehow we have the money to go to a Western hospital that will treat me better. Do you think the WHO should be against the quarantine because of my right to self-defense?
Okay, if you're quarantined, that is not anything to do with your right to self-defense, right? Your quarantine has to do with you not infecting other people. If you're being quarantined, you are going to die either way or survive either way. I'm not really sure what direction that POI is coming out of, right? But also, I want you to note here that a quarantine is a restriction of mobility rights, not a restriction of right to life, right? That's not a fair comparative that is stressing. Let's talk about the outcomes, right? So, first thing to note here, if it's true that the countries leave the WHO, it's incredibly likely that all the other regulations and access and funding and things that came into the WHO simply disappear, right? And note that that was likely to happen because the pharmaceuticals that had such intense lobbying power were likely to push for that action to happen. I think that leads to worse health infrastructure. I think that leads to worse outcomes overall, right? But let's note the world in which they don't leave and they're under this ban and they don't have any pharmaceuticals, even in the short term, in which they're trying to catch up regulations to the acceptable level that opening everyone wants. The issue is not just that people literally get sick and start to die. The issue is that because the health infrastructure is already as jam-packed as opening government describes, you overburden the health system even more. Because now what you're doing is not just giving somebody antibiotics for 15 minutes in a waiting room. Now what you're doing is taking care of hundreds of thousands of sick people during a disease outbreak in hospitals when you don't even have the beds. That's the comparative that you exist in a world where everybody in that nation that needs access to the health system is incredibly overrun and unable to care because they have to deal with all the sick people that were not treated under government's model, right? But I also want to note here that this debate is not just about people, it's also about agriculture, right? I think it's important to note that the point at which agriculture is not successfully regulated, you can lead to things like mass death of food sources, right? This is how you create things like famine and malnourishment in these countries, right? If that's the outcome you create even more long-term health problems and even further crises for that country, and you force the country to bear the brunt of a global health crisis, right? Last thing I want to say here is when they leave, if they do leave the WHO, right, I think it's very possible that we see long-term inability to ever get these regulations in the future. The natural path of encouraging incentives, getting better health infrastructure to successfully regulate is always going to be the better alternative to get the regulations versus never having that if they leave. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition leader for that speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for government. Yeah.
Whatever opening opposition says is true, it's actually more likely that it's going to trigger a change and actually our model is likely to be applied. Before I move on to explaining all that, some direct engagement first. On the principle, right? I think the principle is sort of weird in the sense that they don't engage to anything that suggests that it's going to change and it's going to actually lead to better self-defense. Because recognize that if medicinal usage is a form of self-defense, then you want the proper medicinal usage as opposed to an improper form of medicinal usage that cripples your ability to go for self-defense in the long run, ladies and gentlemen. Which means that in this particular case, if you're taking something for self-defense and you're unaware of the fact how you're taking it and the dosage to which you're taking it, it's supposed to systematically cripple your ability to self-defend yourself in the future, and that's particularly problematic. Worst case scenario that this is taken away, even in that particular case, it's probably justified to do so because of this simple reason that one, these individuals do not know how they're acting and when they're acting in this particular case, but two, their ability to prolong their lives and the fact that they want to live in a proper way, that in and of itself is also an extension of the self-defense principle that is likely to accrue. Which is to say that dosage and proper usage is of paramount importance in this particular case and that cannot be ignored. Thirdly, even if this is to somehow magically stop drugs, etc., in the vast majority of cases, in case of agriculture pharmaceuticals, there's often some alternative to these particular drugs, antibiotics, etc., that can be used in other ways that probably take a longer time. However, the reason antibiotics are used is because of a swift recovery that our doctors want that harms your health in the long run. Even if it takes a longer period of time, yes, it probably cripples your ability to go to work for the next week or so. In general, this is probably likely to not lead to the sort of harms that they talk to you about. So for that premise to stand, they need to show the exact type of harms that leads to death in this particular case. Secondly, they say that the people are not culpable. We tell you that the state and the systematic infrastructure of the pharmaceutical companies is absolutely culpable and we can hold them to account, and the people in general should be made aware of the things that they do. And the other quibble is, there's a systematic inability to fix this. Not true to a large extent, because understand that WHO has a large presence in these particular areas, especially because of the fact that WHO is a part of the United Nations and the fact that it has great amounts of infrastructure set up in these particular states that are able to systematically audit and do all of those regulatory stuff in these places. I think all of these countries even have pharmaceutical regulations, etc., etc. It's the problem that the government often does not have a democratic incentive to do so, as Sajid already explained to you. Then the other problem is, they will bow out from WHO, and that's a particular problem because MNCs will pressurize them to bow out of WHO. Not true for a lot of reasons. Number one, if there is a particular MNC that is literally trying to force a country to bow out of WHO, first, with a lot of consumer activism, even in the developed world, can impact this. We will say that for a large amount of time, when Walmart was trying to do fuckery in Bangladesh through regulations into the garment industry, consumer activism in the developed world actually worked to a large extent in bringing factory regulations to these parts of countries. We think MNCs are systematically unable to do this because they have a reputation to protect that in and of itself translates into marketing and sales for these particular places. Secondly, we think certain WHO benefits that these countries get means that the government is able to lobby against the pharmaceutical companies in this particular case. Because of the simple reason that WHO is operating in the most vulnerable zones, for example, Ebola affected or AIDS affected zones in these particular countries, then the government is likely to still want that happening in their country and pressurize the domestic companies and the multinational companies to comply to these regulations systematically in this particular case. Which means this. The WHO, they are unlikely to bow out from the WHO in this particular instance because the WHO has systematic power over the government, and if the WHO does not have, which is the worst case scenario, then this happens. So their categorization is as such. You do not get access to medicines in particular places, and therefore people die or people suffer for a long time. When people don't die, but when people are suffering in these particular cases, they are now fully aware and are able to understand all of the impacts, etc., etc. The reason any other alternative is unlikely to work is because of the simple reason. If you go up there and try to provide them with information about compliance, etc., they are not likely to listen to you because the hegemony of information that doctors have. The only way you can break this is to make sure that either there is a regulatory authority enacting this. Two, the newspapers are talking about this because this directly affects the trade and availability of these drugs in these particular cases, which forces them to listen and start a conversation in these particular cases as to what the government can do and what these countries can do. We tell you that there are accountability systems within these countries that are likely to occur, but also Sajid already explained to you why for certain governments this is particularly important. But I'm going to give you a lot more material on why they'll comply. But before I move on, closing if you have.
Great. Your case is that the World Health Organization has an enormous amount of influence in these relevant countries. But if this is the case, why can they not already get them to comply with such standards?
Because of the simple reason that there is no incentive in this particular case, and the carrot is not particularly working, because for you to do something in this particular case against the pharmaceutical lobbying, etc., that you're talking about, you probably need some enforcement mechanism, some coercive mechanism to bring to the table and do these things. So this also directly fits into my extension of why will they comply in these particular cases. One, we do not think in certain cases the sorts of threats that these governments fear in coming from external entities apply in this particular case. We just say that when it's economic sanctions or political sanctions that are put on these countries, these often harm the nationalistic pride or other pride or anything that's political in these countries. This does not occur in this particular case. This is a WHO regulation. It's related to health, and the countries are actually likely to comply and show that they are willing to make progress in health. This means that this is an indicator for these governments to act in this particular case. So, for example, if you look at the vast majority of the developing world, even in the democratic to dictatorial regimes, indicators of things like health, economy, etc., are incredibly important for these countries to maintain because they want to show some credibility to their people so that they can either get elected or stay in power for the longest amount of time. Which means when WHO enforces this as a regulation, this becomes a global indicator of how well you are doing as a country in that health indicator in this particular case. Secondly, oftentimes, if there is a lot of domestic lobbying coming from elite groups such as doctors, etc., etc., the only way that the government either has an incentive to act or has an ability to act is when they have something like the WHO backing them up, because they give you systematic power to counteract the forms of lobbying that goes on within the domestic level in these particular cases. And this is particularly important because these pharmaceutical companies rely on these ingredients and import for sales, as Sajid already explained to you. But secondly, because consumer activism even within these countries can be used to make sure that these pharmaceutical companies comply. Consumer activism already does exist in these countries to a certain extent. They are nascent, they do not get any attention, they have no ability to lobby anything in their particular case. If the WHO and the government itself is giving them the push to make sure that there are regulatory changes throughout the industry, they are then able to do so. needs to show to you why these countries will not change. Also needs to show to you, even when they do not change, why is it such an assault on self-defense that this is crippling. Incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the TPM for that speech. Welcome the Deputy Op Leader to conclude the open. Here.
Opening government has three central failings. The first is that they never engage with the people that actually need these drugs. They literally only talk about the people that have the common goal that are currently misusing these drugs. No one gives you a case as to why we are actively harming people that will literally die if they do not get this medicine. And the only response we get at the DPM is, oh, no, they didn't prove that death happens. Okay, let me do that, right? I think that in a lot of cases, there are bacterial infections that can literally cause loss of life, particularly in the developing nations that we're talking about, right? Recognize that other forms of medicine often do not exist. Other forms of sanitation do not exist. It is particularly these nations that often need antibiotics to save life in Western nations and other developed nations that don't actually need it just to not miss a week of work. Secondly, though, and more fatally, I think they never prove to you uniqueness, right? The only thing they rest on is we ought to provide an incentive for countries to comply. If that is true, we have no understanding why necessarily this motion specifically is the one that creates that incentive in the best way, right? There are a million things you can do. You can raise prices of these antibiotics. You could only use WHO distributors. You can educate doctors and/or change infrastructure via WHO is as powerful as they want to assert, right? All of these things also get the impacts they want. They just don't deprive sick people of medicine that will save their life, right? They never prove to you any kind of uniqueness of their model. I think that is hugely fatal to their case, especially insofar as they rest so much of it on incentives of nations. But finally, they never meaningfully weigh to you the harms of antibiotic resistance in and of itself, right? They just assert to you that it is a boogeyman that we must avoid at all costs. I don't think that's true, right? No one gives you analysis as to why, even if we believe that resistance happens more on our side of the house, I think that at the end of the day, the right to life of people that need these antibiotic drugs and the ability of them to access them is far more important, even at a national level in terms of nations. Having a right to access medicine that exists in terms of the human race is probably an important thing. They never meaningfully weigh what resistance looks like, especially in the context of a medical world where we are already creating new antibiotics to solve this resistance anyways. I don't really understand why necessarily resistance to things like penicillin are somehow so harmful that we ought to let people die on their side of the house. Okay. Even though, if CG is somehow able to handle all of these burdens, here's why Noah still takes this debate with his case. Firstly, on the principle, right? Noah tells you that the right to life is enshrined in a way that should not interfere with any kind of governmental regulation. He tells you this for a number of reasons. He says that even though people might be contributing to environmental harms at the point to which they might be misusing antibiotics and or creating an antibiotic resistance that will later harm people, they have the right in that immediate situation to fight for their life, right? It is a matter of directness, even though they might be contributing indirectly to a larger problem that we need to tackle. At the point at which there is a literal threat to life, we think it is reasonable and justified for them to do this. We get no engagement from opening government on this. But secondly, overuse is not a direct harm, and that also leads to another things that we get even out of CG, right? If you look at something like a refusal to medicine, or something like allowing someone infected with Ebola to go out into their society and infect other people, those are far more direct harms, right? We think at the point at which we have medicine to save someone's life, it is not in the hands of doctors, and it is not in the hands of the WHO to say that person ought not access that medicine. No thanks. Secondly, then on culpability, right? Noah tells you that we ought to imply regulations and restrictions that affect the people who are at fault for bad policy. Again, take opening governments at best. Say that these regulations are completely possible in the infrastructures that exist in these nations. Still, we see no reason as to why the people that need these drugs should be the ones that are most affected, right? The only mech they give you as to why governments are likely to comply is because they're scared of their populations being angry. I don't think, one, that is a reasonable enough mechanism to say that that's true insofar as there are multiple things that affect democracies, and often these nations might not even necessarily be super akin or accountable to their people. But secondly, I think at the point at which you are able to create other incentives, again as I tell you at the beginning of my speech, in a multitude of other ways, what government needed to prove to you was why specifically we ought to ban the sale of medicine wholesale from these nations. I think that is a huge overreaction that doesn't necessarily target the people that we want to. Secondly, though, Noah tells you that governments often cannot do this, right?
He tells you that infrastructure is extremely challenging. He tells you that there is a lack of time often, and there's a trade-off between how many patients a doctor can see in the day if they have to actively diagnose each person and see whether they need antibiotics, right? At the point at which you have people lined up to your door and will literally fill your entire day, and there's a question between, do I inspect this person thoroughly to see whether they need antibiotics, or do I just give them an antibiotic that hopefully can work so I can see the next patient? They, again, never weigh this trade-off on their side of the house, right? But thirdly, no one tells you that pharmaceutical companies often have nefarious interests in these regions. Now, on the DPM's responses to this. First of all, they tell you that pharma cares about optics. Again, just an assertion, right? Also, not really empirically true. I think largely pharmaceutical companies have mostly been interested in profits. They've actively stymied a lot of valuable medicine and medical practices for the sake of their profit, even in developed nations. But secondly, I think they massively undervalue the huge amount of capital cost and political cost that exists in terms of implementing this infrastructure. One, I think it is less likely that the WHO is able to implement effective infrastructure that curtails antibiotic resistance at the point at which countries now feel antagonized by the WHO and are far less likely to work with them amicably. But secondly, infrastructure is harder than OG would have you believe, right? Recognize that even the most developed nations in the world, like the US, struggle with pharmaceutical prescriptions to the point at which pharma companies, even in US clinics, are causing overprescription through things like bribes, right? If that doesn't work properly in places like the US, we need much more analysis as to why necessarily this is likely to happen with WHO involvement in places like South Asia or Africa. Closing.
Yeah. As a vegetarian, I know that 90% of the antibiotic is used on cattle and agriculture. We don't care so much about the dog sources, right? We care about the industry prescribing it to everyone.
Yeah. So I still think there is a huge amount of principle that they need to engage with as to why necessarily we ought to deprive wholesale. Recognize that at the point at which they pick this specific motion to solve their issue, they need to engage with the complete ban of these drugs. But we will engage on the fact that this is largely agriculture as well, as Noah tells you. First of all, often this agriculture is again hard to regulate, especially if they want to sit on the fact that doctors are easy to regulate. I have no idea how we're going to do this for farmers. But secondly, I think that even in terms of agriculture, antibiotics are particularly important in developing countries where you have things like water sanitation issues, right? It's often hard to provide sanitary water to things like cattle, and you often need antibiotics for those reasons. I think the reason we see a lot of misuse of antibiotics in agriculture is specifically because the developed world is too lazy to use other methods. I think it's particularly needed in developing nations, and I think they disproportionately harm them in trying to tackle this problem. Finally, though, on outcomes, right? Recognize that OG is largely assertive as to how this actually works in terms of compliance. Noah tells you it is far more likely that these countries leave the WHO, especially if they're getting pressure from their populace to regain the ability to take these drugs. I think someone that was used to walking into the pharmacy each day to take their antibiotic is far more amenable to getting that drug back, and therefore the government is likely to just to leave the WHO and find another seller. What are the impacts of this? One, I think you lose the ability to educate doctors through the WHO. Right? The WHO can't get involved in things like infrastructure like they want. You lose the ability of regulation. You lose the ability to educate these doctors in meaningful ways from the WHO when these countries lose. At the end of the day, we think governments have failed their burden and no one is giving meaningful principled analysis as well as practical outcomes as to why this ultimately harms the most vulnerable in our world and doesn't solve the issues. So,
I'd like to thank the Deputy Operator for that speech. Welcome the government member to continue the case of government.
Thank you. As you just heard, everyone who talks 5 minutes with Ido, he's a vegetarian. And he knows that 90% of the problem is antibiotics that get to whole herds of animals just to make them 5% healthier and bigger and get a lot of money from it. Okay? And we think this is the biggest issue in this debate. Why? Because changing some ethics of doctors is not that hard. Give it only to people with actual heat. Or even if there is not a big change of doctors, just by making 30% change in agriculture will be such a huge change that will be enough in order for the WTO to actually feel that there's a compliance there. So that is the main, so most of the things that we hold on top half doesn't really matter. Secondly, it means that because it's a lot easier to change the incentive, economical incentive of country by making it harder. It will be a lot easier to solve the problem. Okay, I have 2 points. First of all, why, if we are not going to decrease the use of antibiotics, millions of people are going to die not only in those countries but all around the world in the years to come. And secondly, why we think there's a market failure today that we are solving by making them give less antibiotics. Okay, the first couple of thoughts of rebuttal. Look, people are going to die if they're not going to get antibiotics. First of all, we're going to show you that the likely scenario is compliance, so people are not going to die, just get the amount of medicine they want. Secondly, if we show that millions of people more are going to die in those countries and around the world in the developed and the developing world, it's just a lot bigger. And then let us, they have a right to self-defense. Maybe, but we don't need to give them the means in order to do that. Even if they have the right to take antibiotics, we shouldn't give. We don't have the obligation to give them antibiotics if it's going to hurt us and other people. Okay. Then they tell us, look, the US is going to leave WTO because now they can't sell to Africa. Look, most of the amount of money that they get from developing countries is very small. Most of that is subsidized. It's sold in a very low. It's going to be it's sold by very cheap to developing world. There's not a lot of money there, and most of the money comes from subsidized by the US. So there's going to be a big lobby of actually taking that money and put it on American healthcare and not on developing. So we don't think they're going to feel that bad about paying less. Okay? Then let us let's just raise the price. First of all, millions of people are going to die if you're going to raise the price of antibiotics to the amount of actually changing the incentive. The whole principle falls if they're for lowering the price. Exactly. Why do you have to ban it? Because we think that the incentive of agriculture to get antibiotics from wherever they can is so big that even if they will still going to get most of the antibiotics they're getting today, even if we'll have other rules by not, but the only way to stop them is by banning. So let's talk about antibiotics, because we are in war. Not a long time ago, every person who had a cold had like 50% of dying from an infection. Most of the people in this world were dying as children. The only way we stopped it by inventing penicillin and antibiotics. And we had a couple of decades of actual success, of actual luck that we didn't, that we still find other antibiotics. What is the problem? First of all, antibiotics all around the world is becoming less effective. More people are dying today because it takes more antibiotics and some bacteria are not dying. Secondly, we are finding less and less antibiotics. Why? Because all the low-hanging fruit we already found, and because the way that antibiotics works is very similar one to another. So when there is one resistant drug, they usually have resistance to a lot of different antibiotics, and it's very hard to find totally new antibiotics. And lastly, even when we find an antibiotic, it's usually expensive, like 100 or 1,000% more than the old ones. So there's a huge amount of people who can't afford it and just die because we have the medicine and we can't sell it to them. What does that mean? It means that more and more diseases are becoming without don't have any kind of cure, and people are dying in the developing and developed world. It means that in those countries, in a couple of years, if we are not going to stop it, even if we give them all the antibiotics in the world, they will not be able to save their own citizens. More than that, it means that every country surrounding this country, that because the bacteria move and mutate very, very fast, all of the countries around this country are also people are going to die there because of diseases in a very small amount of time. In the West, people are going to die. We see that, that today, even when we put all of our research and all of our money, people are still dying in the West because of antibiotics doesn't effective, and we think it's just going to get worse, and the developing country is going to be the last we're actually going to get, even if we find any kind of new medicine in the future. Okay? And not only that, because antibiotics is not only important for people, it's also important for food and for animals, and for like things like meat. If you have some kind of infection that is going to kill half of the cattle in Southeast Asia or in Africa, it means that people are going to die from starvation if they are not sick. The same thing if a new kind of bacteria for wheat is going to spread, it means that we are going to have huge problems in our world, and we won't be able to have the tools to actually fight it, because today we just spreading it on fields because it's cheaper than checking places who really have the problem. It is easier to put it to all of your cattle than actually finding out the one who are giving a better hygiene, or finding out the one who are actually sick and giving it only to them, because it takes so much time and effort. We need to stop it now before millions of people are going to die. But now, before why it's going to be effective, second, your extension, please.
So you give us a doomsday case about the effect of antibiotic resistance. The problem is that this is non-unique to countries not enforcing the WHO standards. Places like the US, for example, which follow the standards, still have these problems because of use.
First of all, if we need to ban it for the US, we'll do it too. And secondly, if half of the world is going to use less antibiotics, there's going to be huge change than if only the US will going to do it. So you're going to tell us, oh, there is still a problem. Yes, but it's going to be huge on your side and exist on our side. Okay? Let's talk what's going to happen. Because today there's a market failure. Okay? If one country decides to use antibiotics and they get better cattle and better agriculture, they can sell it to every country in the region and get a lot more money from the others, while every country next to it are still going to get all of the resistant diseases because they don't care about the borders, and when there is one mutation, all of the countries are getting infected. It means that every country is afraid that all of the countries around it are going to use antibiotics, and they have the incentive to just use it before it's going to become ineffective. It means that only by banning it for all of them, when we tell them all of you are not going to get the antibiotics unless you are going to do it, then we're actually helping them to do what they already want because they don't want the resistant themselves. This is why there's going to be compliance, because they want to do it. Secondly, because as we told you, the main incentive here are economical. They will get more money by agriculture. If we take away all the antibiotics, of course they're going to lose more money. So the incentive to actually comply and get the amount of antibiotics that will let them by the WTO. Because it's effective, because it will prevent a world disaster, please propose. Thank you very much.
Thank the government member for that speech and welcome opposition member to continue to answer opposition. Here.
To some degree, we agree with the doomsday case of closing government. The antibiotic resistance really presents a challenge to humanity. But that is exactly why we must preserve the ability of the pharmaceutical industry to prevent these kinds of impacts by securing innovation and investment in the sector. Causing a trade war in pharmaceuticals would destroy this. On these bases, we'll bring you 2 points in extension. Before that, dealing swiftly with opening government. They give us 3 mechanisms of change. First, people get angry. No argument about why people will blame the actual government which is allowing these abuses. Not will blame, I don't know, foreigners, weak international institutions like the WHO, instead, which are easy political targets. Second, they tell us that the pharmaceutical industry will be angry. There's an argument on top half largely about leaving the WHO, but not any discussion of whether they can just lobby successfully at the WTO for lower standards. There's an argument briefly made by OO. 3 reasons, though, why we'll actually be successful at changing the standards. First, Western influence is enormous and pervasive at the WHO, just like at the WTO. Second, a strong revolving door between those who set the rules and are judges at the WHO and those who are in the pharmaceutical industry. Third, finally, no marginal cost to suing and acting on this basis because these companies have strong legal teams on retainer and are already fighting many fights on this front. They have every incentive to put even a little bit of money to go a long way in this, but they don't have to put any into it because they're already fighting similar fights. They can immediately shift all their focus. Third and finally, though, is the POI I gave. They say the WHO is their final mechanism for change. But if the WHO is as strong as they describe in these countries, why can they not get them to enforce them already? Let's move into my points in extension. First, on protecting and keeping innovation. On their side of the house, there's going to be far, far less innovation. Why? First, if it is the case that they successfully ban exports, then you massively decrease the incentive to actually put investment into the sector. Now, you might get around this by closing government's quick quip that they sell this for very cheap. It's literally nothing. What is the problem with this? They may sell them for cheap, but clearly the problem that everyone is talking about is they sell a lot of them, far too many. So even if the prices are low, they're selling a lot. They have a lot of revenue staked on this. The second reason, though, is let's assume that even for the most part, there is compliance. Why is this still extremely destructive? Because of uncertainty. This is exactly the major problem with the trade war. It isn't the tariffs themselves. It's that no one knows what's going to happen next. Who's going to comply with these and when? Where should I put my money? My dominant strategy is to take money out entirely to make sure that I don't lose anything. As a result, then, even if they get a meaningful and material amount of compliance, they are losing this. What are the impacts of this? First, dramatically less investment as a first-order effect or higher prices charged. Now, why is this so important? And why is innovation in this sector the most important argument in the round that you're going to vote for us on? First, because resistance is inevitable. This was my POI, that even if countries maintain WHO standards of compliance, they will still have major antibiotic resistance problems. How do we know this? Developed nations, like the United States, who comply with these standards, still have internal antibiotic resistance dramatically on the rise. It is not unique to follow these standards. Sure, it gets slightly worse. The point is, it's happening. We need people to invest in these. Second, though, because it affects far more people, future generations, and everyone conceivably in the future is affected by the drugs that we will have then, rather than the drugs we will have now. Third, on our side of the house, we have the potential to outright solve the problem with radical solutions as dramatic as the invention of penicillin in the 20th century can only exist when you have these types of innovations. The case we get from closing government that actually that investment in the sector is likely not or innovations will be hard to find is precisely why we need lots of investment in the sector, not why we don't need it. The only way you can overcome this problem, given that we will need ways to overcome this problem or make sure people don't die because of it, is because of this on our side of the house. What are the other special problems we get with this? First, innovative spillover. That is, so many innovations are created not by a direct purpose, but instead by accident. So when you lose investment in this massive medical sector, what happens is you lose other groundbreaking and life-saving technologies that are developed as a byproduct of this. Second, and incredibly damningly, consider opening government's model. They aren't just banning the drugs, they're banning the ingredients for them. What is the problem? These ingredients are not, ingredients is done, we're not cooking. These inputs to these goods are not merely for them. Instead, the inputs into a given drug, there are thousands of them that go into not just antibiotics, but many other medical products. As a result, investment in these decrease as well. And this means that simple things that aren't even antibiotics, but instead other medical products or ones that aren't being abused are totally destroyed on their side of the house. For that, opening.
All your impacts connect to so much harm is going to be caused because of the lack of investment. Is that not another reason why a global indicator such as this will force them to comply?
No, it isn't, because it means that the people, the private actors who are relevant here, are going to be scared to invest because they either don't comply, arguments based on that, or they're just literally afraid that it'll happen. There's some risk of it. They destroy that. Remember, investment is incredibly mobile, so if there's even a 1% increased risk on their side of the house, all the capital moves into finance or something, and they're destroyed. But I also think that compliance, very, very unlikely. Why? First, people, that is, the Western nations that are exporting drugs, are very, very interested in their economic outcomes rather than in their political influence at the WHO. This is an argument actually opening government makes at the beginning of their first speech. Second, international institutions have a very poor history of enforcement and thus credibility. How do we know this? The motion slide literally says countries talking about already don't care about WHO regulations. Third and finally, though, they're easy to make fun of and scapegoated because they're foreign actors without much legitimacy or international credibility. You don't really have to care about them very much. But what can we do on our side of the house? Dramatically less restrictive mechanisms of change. This may not look like price rises, but what does it look like? It looks like, instead of stopping exports entirely, stopping exports above the sustainable level, such that you actually just don't have all the abuses that they have. Or an easy one, just find the countries, guys. The only way you can have these kind of milquetoast, less radical situations is by making sure that you don't have excessively radical policies. What is the analogy here? If you were to tax people at, say, 100%, what might happen is a revolution in your country. In the same way, if you actually ban exports of pharmaceutical products, they might leave the WTO or WHO, lobby for lower standards, as we said. But what happens at our side of the house is you can have regulation and compliance through negotiation. We bring them into the WHO. We say, why are you abusing these standards, and what can we do to help? What compromise can we create? This is exactly how every WHO regulation on the books has come about. It has been because of negotiation universally between states about what is in their interest, such that it happens. But finally, though, we get a damning concession from closing government. They say the problem is if one country gets it, then it can spread everywhere. Yes, so if there is even a small chance of miscompliance, guess what? It's over. It's done. We win on our side of the house. For these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the top members for that speech. Welcome the government whip to conclude the case of the year.
So I think there was quite a lack of engagement to the fact that we told you why it is quite reasonable that literally like millions of people are going to die with high probability. Just saying that it might happen otherwise is not enough to actually not like rebut our case of the fact that it's going to happen on our side. If opposition then concedes the fact that on our side of the house people are going to massively die, we think that's a huge harm, and we, if they want to rebut it, we don't have any way to like engage with the rebuttal because all of their sanity is like they have other harms. So I'm going to do three things. Firstly, just quickly throw out CO out to this debate. Secondly, talk about self-defense or why we have to do those things. And thirdly, talk about why compliance and why it is going to work. So firstly, let's keep CO out of this debate. Those are different pharmaceutical companies. The companies that are selling to the developing world are generic drugs. Those are the drugs that don't have patents, that are very cheap, and the kind of firms that are doing that are not the same firms who have the patents, which means that even if those companies lose a lot of money, don't have the resources to do all of those things, it doesn't matter to all of the other companies that are doing innovation. Because you know why the same incentives to innovation exists? Because those innovations are already patented on this world, and the only people who can buy them are the rich people in the Western world, and those incentives of the rich people to buy new drugs does not change on their side of the house. Which means that everything CEO says about not getting new drugs does not apply to this debate at all. Bye-bye. Let's talk about self-defense. Because what do we get from OO? People have the right to self-defense, and therefore we should give them antibiotics. So firstly, as Amichai told you, we don't think that their right to self-defense means that we have to give them the means to defend themselves when it actually harms us. We think that this is not what included within your right to defend yourself, and we are a different actor in this debate. But secondly, we tell you, like I told you in a POI, that this right to self-defense is not like without any limits. If by defending yourself, you are harming other people much more, we don't give you the right to self-defense. This is why we keep people in quarantine, although they might get better drugs and better treatment if they go to other places where they also can infect other people. We think this harms their ability to cure much more, but we still do that. So what did we tell you about why it creates much bigger harms on our side of the house? Because OG has already said a sentence, it might cause other diseases. But it actually give you the analysis on why those things are going to happen and what are those effects. Because we're telling them, but then what we can just get new antibiotics. Getting antibiotics is easy. We've actually given you the analysis on why it is unlikely to be true. Firstly, because it's extremely hard nowadays to get new antibiotics in different ways to fight those viruses. Because even if you have like some kind of new antibiotics, in most of the cases, it works quite similarly to the other things, which means that they're, like the viruses who are immune to one of them are also immune to the other one. But secondly, we told you that the other kinds of antibiotics are much more expensive, which means that on their side of the house, even if there is another kind of antibiotics, most of their harm still happens, because those countries won't have the money to buy the most expensive new antibiotic that exists on the market. And that is actually similar to those countries to just not have the cure at all, which means that all of our harms of why people are gonna die massively when there is actually no cure for those diseases are going to happen as well. But what have we told you more than that? Because we've told you that like uniquely, people are going to massively die because of like two different reasons. Firstly, because actually new diseases are being created because of those things. Diseases that we can't treat. Diseases that if they spread, we don't have any means to get on with them. Diseases that can actually be the new like things that kill 50% of the population that we can't handle with. We think this is a massive threat that we can't allow to happen at any cost. But secondly, we told you that it is not only about human. Like the fact that the wheat in the entire world can die away because a new virus that it is immune to all of the antibiotics might evolve because of the massive use of antibiotics means that there is a chance for mass starvation all around the world. We think that even if it is like a 10% chance, it is a chance for the entire humanity does not have the most basic and cheap food that there exists. We think this is quite huge. So what our CEO are telling us this? But you said that even if one country used this in your like market failure, then it's bad enough. No, they didn't listen. We said that if only one country does not use it and all of the other countries are using it, then it is bad. But if only one country uses it, obviously the chance that this virus will happen is much, much lower than if every country in the world is using those antibiotics. Which means that we do reduce those chances very much significantly. Why is that so important? Because that means that even if this doesn't work, even if like a million people are going to die in those countries, we still have the right and actually the obligation to do so if it stops all of the other humanity to die because of those like wrong actions of those people. We think this is incredibly important in this debate and wasn't engaged at all. I'm going to give OO a chance to engage if they want.
Yeah, your side tells us that people are used to seeing these drugs in the shop and taking them regularly. Given that, our government is more likely to comply with regulations that still keep those drugs off the shelf for most people, or just leave the WHO and find another.
Okay, so firstly, we told you that you don't care about people so much. Like most of those stuff happens in other industries, like the agriculture industry or the cattle industry or the beef industry or all of those kind of stuff. So we don't care about people as much. But secondly, it's quite easy to pass on those new regulations. We don't think it is so unlikely in this debate. And obviously, even if the country does not support that, people are not going to see the antibiotics on the shelf on your side of the house because those countries are not being sold antibiotics. So they can't see them. So that like the norm shifts obviously also happens on your side of the house, even if they don't agree to comply to this motion. So let's talk about compliance. Because OO has told us mainly that countries are gonna go out from the WHO and leave, and therefore there will be no compliance. We think this is ridiculous. Firstly, we can just give hardened sanctions on countries that leave, also not sell to them. So obviously countries won't want to leave if you don't sell to them either. We think it's quite easy. But secondly, like most pharmaceutical companies won't want to leave because a lot of the money comes from subsidy from the WHO. So when they leave, they lose a lot of the money. We don't think they have the incentive to lobby against them staying in the WHO. But what we uniquely tell you, firstly, why the other solutions are not going to work because of this market failure, because of the immense pressure that those companies have on those governments, because you have the excuse of saying, if I'm the only one who's doing this, it doesn't make any difference. Which means that, like, even if we just cap the amount of antibiotics that come to these countries, if tell you why it is more likely that the corrupt regimes will give most of them to the agriculture and the cattle industry because they have such a big lobby power within those governments. But what happens on our side of the house? Those incentives shifts because as a cattle company that now can't use antibiotics because they are not sold in my country, I have to switch to other solutions as well. Which means that my incentive to keep the government like not complying to the WHO rules are not existing because they don't benefit anything if I don't do it because I, in both of the sides, have to use other means because they don't have antibiotics accessible. This is what actually solves the problems. Please support